everybody, Wayne here. In today's overview and review, I'm taking a look at Red Dust Rebellion, designed by Carmichael and published by GMT Games. Red Dust Rebellion is a 1 to 4 player asymmetrical wargame that is the 12th game in the Coin or Counter-Insurgency series of wargames. I've only played the game solitaire, and that is the perspective of this review. Red Dust Rebellion takes the Coin series into the 23rd century and tells the story of a future revolt on Mars against the Martian authorities supported by the Earth government. Let's do a quick overview. I have an extensive tutorial playthrough video for an in-depth look at the game. I'll cover my pros and cons, and I'll end with my final thoughts. All right, let's get on to the table. All right, Red Dust Rebellion is a large and complex game, so I'm going to do my best to give you an overview of it so everything makes sense, my review makes sense. If you've never played the game before, without spending too much time on it, definitely check out my tutorial playthrough video for really more in-depth, and then actual gameplay for nearly 2 hours. Okay, so we'll start off by looking at the entire board. I'll cover the factions, we'll look at event cards, the sequence of play, and then overall kind of victory, what the factions are striving for. So you can see the board out here. You have the map of Mars and different spaces on Mars. You have the Aldrin Cycler spaces up here. You have the sequence of play spaces where you're choosing actions for the different factions, and some holding boxes and tracks. And then finally, along the very top, you have the track where you keep track of resources for several of the factions, along with the victory and where each faction stands. Let's start at the top left and kind of work our way around. Mention the Aldrin Cycler. This is where you are bringing resources and population, along with troops from Earth in transit, and then reaching Phobos, and from there, they are moved to the surface of Mars. My event cards right here, I just happen to place them there. That's not necessarily a spot for them. I'll cover them in a minute. Getting down to Mars. So you have different locations within each of these boxes here, and then you have this spot called the Wilderness. Within each of these locations, so let's look at Tharsis Montes here. You have these large circular areas are called labyrinths. Those are the cities on Mars, or the cities underneath Mars. It's abstracted, of course, but whether underground, above ground, dome cities, regardless, those are where the larger groups of populations are. Outside of them are going to be your desert spaces, and then bordering the extra deserts, and then leading into it is the wilderness. That is the vast areas of Mars that are untamed with no real population to speak of. Within each of the spaces, other than the wilderness, because again, it is not populated, but within the labyrinths and within all the desert spaces, there's going to be these boxes here. You're on the far left, you're going to have a box that is going to show you whether it's neutral, it supports the opposition, which are the Counter-Insurgency factions, which I'll cover the factions in just a second, so I'm done with the board, or whether it shows support for the Coin factions. You can see here there is a red passive opposition. It can go up to active opposition, and then for blue, for the Coin, they also have active or passive support. Next to that is a green space that shows the population. A labyrinth like Europa, you can see, has 2 population, and then the symbol there is a spaceport, which allows travel in between labyrinths. And these dark gray areas here are places where you could potentially house or place additional displaced population if you so choose. Going out into the desert, you're going to see spaces like this where this base is. And again, we'll cover kind of the units when we get to factions. You have maglevs lines that allow travel in between labyrinths. You can also go into the desert, and then from the desert, travel to different areas, although that is a little bit more difficult than taking a maglev line in between labyrinths. The spaceports, like I mentioned before, also allow travel. Getting outside the sort of spaces, the locations, the boxes here, I mentioned the idea of control and of support and opposition, right? So you see I have some control markers out, Coin control, I have RD control, which is red dust, which are these red units. When you have a majority of units in an area, that space is going to be under that faction's control. Coin, which is made up of Martian Gov and Earth Gov, so blue and black, they team up together as Coin. And the Insurgents, Red Dust, and Church of the Acclaimer, they actually are separate, so that is why you will see the RD control the red, or CR control the orange here. The boxes on the outside, so let's go into the outside of the map here. You have a flashpoint track. As you are looking at your event cards, there's going to be a flashpoint number on there. When it reaches the end, you're going to go ahead and conduct what's called a flashpoint round. It's kind of a way to reset a little bit, kind of a way to move some things along. Think of it almost as a turn structure. It's not, but think of it that way. You have the Earth government confidence track. So EarthGov, the white troops on here, they are basically going to support whoever they feel has better control on Mars. And whether that's going to be the corporation, the Mars government itself, the Martian government, or no controller at all. So that will change based on events, based on operations and special activities that happen during the game. You have spot for casualties from EarthGov and corporation troops, displaced population, which are the yellow markers, like right over here in Tenzing, and overflow box. If any space becomes too filled, you can go ahead and place units there, and then place the appropriate marker on the map. I think that's it for the actual board itself. So factions, right? I started talking about the factions a little bit. It's hard not to dive into that because that's the core of the game, right? So the game is divided up, like I said before, into Counter-Insurgency coin factions and the insurgent factions. Coin is going to be Martian government, blue, corporations, black. Now let's go ahead and look at a faction mat for the corporations. They have different units here. So they have their corporate security, which are the cubes. They have these hexagon shapes, which are double-sided here. For them, it's spec ops, special ops, and then they have their bases, which you can see for all the units, or all the factions, excuse me, they're going to have either a combination of all or some of these different shaped items. I'm not going to go into the detail of all of them. That would take too long, but every faction similar, but a little bit different. You're going to find that goes for everything in this game. Okay. So that's the coin faction, right? Those are the ones that represent government, law and order, control. And then you have the insurgents, right? The rebellious factions. Those are going to be Red Dust Movement, which are red, and Church of the Claimer, which are orange. Here's an example. Red Dust Movement, their player mat. Now you can see some cards here. So the majority of the game is handled with the units coming, troops and such coming off mats and being on the board. However, the Red Dust Movement, they do have campaign cards, which these are cards that will come into play. And generally speaking, they're something that will remain in play, have an effect, and eventually probably get discarded, changed to a different card. The Church of the Claimers, they have what are called asset cards. So some of the factions keep track of resources on that track up there to pay for the cost of operations and special activities. The Reclaimers, they don't do that. They have cards. Now, some of the cards will be things like events, so much like event cards, which we'll cover in a second. But otherwise, they'll use them as resources. Those are the resources that pay for them to take their actions. And also, sometimes they will have a special effect in the bottom corner, or they may be capability. So now that faction gains a capability, and it sits out there. And while they have it, they're able to do something special, do a special activity, maybe something that harms the coin factions, etc. All right, so speaking of event cards in the game, this is what controls sort of the timing, the actions, etc. So looking at an event card here, the water crisis. A couple things on here. We'll go through everything. So there's that flashpoint number I mentioned where when you build up enough on the track, it causes that sort of in-between cards sort of round reset a little bit. You have the turn order. So every card is different on turn order. This particular card, Corporation will go first. Mars Gov, Red Dust Movement, and then Church of the Reclaimer. Now, whatever factions are eligible, which we'll cover in a second here, those are the ones that they would be able to take their actions, and then you would move on from there. You also have two different events. Generally speaking, there's an unshaded event and a shaded event. Unshaded event usually favors the coin faction. Shaded favors the insurgent faction. As you're moving through the event cards, you're having events, you're taking actions. Eventually, what's going to happen is you are going to reach a Dust Storm card. So, Dust Storm card, and there are going to be 3 in the deck. When the Dust Storm card pops up, you're going to run through, much like the Flashpoint round, but even more severe, even more changes, more of a reset, plus you're checking for victory. So it says right on here, victory, and there's a resource phase, support phase, redeploy, reset phase. If final, end the game, determine victory. Again, there's going to be 3. You're going to be divided between 6 and 12 cards in each. So you could be potentially play through as many as 36 event cards, or though likely, based on odds, it's going to be fewer than that. Let's see here. So the sequence of play I mentioned with the event cards, right? So when you have factions taking actions, and I mentioned the Water Crisis card here has Corporation First and Marsgov. Say they take their actions and they don't do anything to change their order or anything like that. So Corporation takes a certain action, and then Marsgov takes theirs, and I'll cover that in a second here. Though that card is now done because both spots are taken up. These 2 would go to ineligible factions, and then for the next card that is drawn, now you have Red Dust Movement and Church of the Claimers. They can take their actions. Once they're done, you'd rotate back just like that. Now I mentioned sort of the actions here, so looking at the sequence of play chart, when you pick your action for that faction, so say the Corporation, they can do, he's gone rogue on me, so guess what? We're not going to do him. We're going to do Marsgov. So he picks first faction can do operation with no special activity, and then the second faction can only do a limited operation, basically more limited. I'm not going to go into the rules on that. First faction can do with a special activity, which the second faction can do a limited op or run the event, pick the event off the card. First faction, you can just pick the event if you like it. Second faction then can do a full operation plus special activity. So based on what the first faction chooses, that dictates what the second faction can do on their own. So it's very much sort of if you want to do this thing, well, you're allowing another faction to do something else, and you may not like that. So you may actually pick your action based on who else is going to be going, and then what you want them to do or don't want them to do. All right, so related to factions, the only other thing I want to make sure to cover is that when factions, they're choosing their actions, right? They're choosing a operation, maybe adding a special activity, or the event. I cover the events, that's choosing an event on the card. For their actual actions themselves, you have their operations and special activities. Generally speaking, based on what they can do from the sequence of play, they're picking an operation. Maybe there's no special activity, so it's just an operation, that's it. But if they pick an operation and they can do a special activity, they can do an operation, and then whatever special activity is listed, usually there's 2 of them, then they get to pick one of those 2. So depending on operation, you can't pair some special activities with them. If you're conducting an assault, you can't do public relations at the same time. Sorry, Corporation. I'm not going to run through what each of them do because, again, there's just so much to it. But, yeah, that is every faction has their own sort of similar but slightly different, right, operations and special activities that they're able to do. All right, finally, victory and defeat. I mentioned the track up here, keeping track of everything. Very asymmetrical game here. Every faction is different. Marsgov, they want the total support of the population and EarthGov confidence to be high. They want all that to add up. They have their marker here, and you need to get to 34 during a dust storm round. Corporations, well, they want profit. They want, the simple as that. They have a profit marker. They want to get up to 36. All the things that happen during the game, some are good, some are bad. They just want some profit to show the shareholders on Earth, which there's many different aspects of that we're not going to cover, but it's all related to the mechanisms within the game. Red Dust Movement, so they are trying to get total opposition. So remember the support and opposition, right? The red or blue on the support boxes here, or opposition boxes. Total opposition plus bases. So they want to not only gain the support of the population, they want to build as many of their bases as they can. Finally, Church of the Reclaimers. The orange units here, they want as many areas controlled, so as many spaces controlled as possible, so with control markers, plus their bases built, and they need that to be greater than the total enemy bases. So they don't want the enemy to have a bunch of bases out there all over the place. They want, and by enemy, it's every other faction, right? Including the Red Dust Movement, the red faction. So that's what they need to focus on. Okay, quick and dirty. Probably missed some stuff. Didn't cover everything. This game is very large, very complex. There's a lot to it. So it's just, this period isn't. I don't have time to cover everything. Please watch my tutorial playthrough where I do more in depth on the overview, and also dive into actual gameplay so you get to see everything in action. Okay, that's it for my overview. Let's go down and let me cover my pros and cons. And as always, cons first. All right, first off, while the overall player aids, which I showed a little bit in the overview, so primarily talking about the ones that have the factions on here, there's also a flashpoint round and a dust storm round player aid as well. Although they're well done overall, and I'll talk more about that later, there is some missing info on them related to two of the operations and the need to know whether a space is under coin control or not. The details don't matter for the purposes of my review, other than to state that it's somewhat odd the player aids omit that information, as it is very important, and there appears to be room on here to include some more text. Okay, second thing I want to mention is the tutorial in the playbook and general errata. So, game comes right with a rulebook. There also has a playbook here. And then inside the playbook is a full tutorial that you can set the game up and run through, and it explains what they're doing, what actions, what event cards, and it has diagrams and pictures. Well, like the player aids, very much appreciated and overall well done, but unlike the player aids, tutorial has at least 5 instances of mistakes. There's some wording mistakes and inaccurate diagrams and pictures. While it doesn't matter in the sense the tutorial does do a good job overall of guiding you through the beginning of a game, it can be confusing and disconcerting when you're trying to follow along and your board doesn't quite match the pictures you're shown in the playbook. I know it made me take some time to recheck everything as I was second guessing my work and my interpretation of the game processes. Thankfully, there is an errata and FAQ thread on the game's Red Dust Rebellion's Board Game Geek page that is a great, constantly updated resource for these corrections and others. I definitely recommend checking it out. Okay, my third concern is game length. This is a long game. The average game is likely going to take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. Yes, it can. There is a possibility of a game ending sooner, thanks to how you check for victory twice, right, during those dust storm rounds. But just don't expect to be setting this one up and playing a game in a short afternoon. Red Dust Rebellion is for a dedicated game night with a group, or as a solitaire player, leaving it set up over multiple sessions. Now, you may look at my playthrough video and say, well, Wayne, you got through a third of a game in under 2 hours. Yes, but there's a couple things to realize. One, my video is edited down. I cut out some of the housekeeping and the times that I had, analysis paralysis, right? And I'm just sitting there thinking about what to do. Two, I seeded the event deck how I wanted it. Gasp, I know. I made sure the first Dust Storm card came in at event card 8, which is only one event card away from the soonest it can appear. Otherwise, it could come as late as card 12. The game length is not necessarily a huge negative for everyone, right? Some people don't care how long a game takes to play. In fact, they like longer, more in-depth games. But it is something I want you to be aware of. Okay, that's it for the cons. On to the pros. First off, Red Dust Rebellion is epic, and I do mean that in a lot of ways. From rules, to topic and theme, to the feeling at the end of a game. And when you transition from feeling overwhelmed at the beginning to, and finally you start understanding the game, that feeling of it being just epic grows stronger. You start really appreciating the experience on your table. Second, I love the asymmetry of actions, by which I mean those operations and special activities each faction can take, and the asymmetrical victory conditions. Marsgov, a coin faction, and the Red Dust Movement, an insurgent faction, are trying to win over the local population. In addition to either, building bases for the Dusters or increasing support from Earth for Marsgov. The Church of the Reclaimers each can take control of spaces while building as many of their bases and conversion centers as possible. Meanwhile, corporations are sitting over there wanting profits. That's it. Show them the money. Third, the event cards often do a great job of making it a tough choice to decide between taking the event, picking one of your operations or special activities, or doing something else. Each event card has both a coin event and an insurgent event, and they sometimes aren't a good fit for a particular faction, so it's an easy choice. But just as often, I would find myself looking between the event and the faction's player aid card, trying to decide what I wanted that particular faction to do. I know what operations I need to conduct to move towards victory, but look at that event. That's a pretty powerful tool. Having those choices come up so often is a good thing. It just adds to the sandbox feel, that epic feel that Red Dust Rebellion has. Fourth, the components for this game are very well done. The board is mounted, the cards are good quality, and all the wooden pieces are, they work. They're serviceable, right? At first glance, I don't love that the Red Dust movement pieces are dark, like kind of a maroon red. So let's look at them quick. It kind of doesn't match. Like all the other colors I feel like match pretty well. These, when I first got the game out and I was setting it up, I was like, are you sure that's the same? Am I missing something? Are mine off colored? So I don't love the fact that it's kind of a different color. The faction color is bright red, but the pieces are dark red. But I got used to it. The art design is beautiful, from the illustrations on all the event cards to the ones in the rulebook. They really help bring the theme to life. The board is busy at first glance, can't get around that, but once you understand the mechanisms of the game, it all works really well. And I particularly like the look of the Aldrin Cycler spaces on the top left of the board. I don't know why, it just caught my eye. I also found the player aids to be really helpful. And like I mentioned before, aside from missing one or two items or maybe could use a little bit more clarifying text, I was almost able to play Red Dust Rebellion once I knew the core rules with just the player aids alone. Overall, really well done, GMT. And great job to the artist, Marcos Villarreal Lara. Finally, speaking of components, the game does come with a rather extensive solo bot system. So it features cards for each of the factions. It comes with a rules and reference booklet, and it comes with 3 different player aids, all focused on that solo bot. I'm not diving too deep into the solo system here in my review because I wanted this review to focus on the game and the game systems themselves. But the bot, named Curiosity, works to play any faction in the game. My favorite when I tried the bot was to play as the coin factions myself, Marsgov and Corporation, and let the bot manage the insurgent factions, the Red Dusters and Reclaimers, against me. It's not an easy or fast bot to manage. It will require an additional mechanic to learn, and actions to monitor while playing, which does add to the burden to an already heavy game. Thankfully, someone has designed a helper app called Sky Crane, which helps with managing the bots, as long as you don't mind, keeping an app running on your phone or a tablet. You can find links to the app over on Red Dust Rebellion's Board Game Geek page. All right, so for my pros and cons, let's end with my final thoughts. Red Dust Rebellion is easily a contender for Game of the Year in 2024. It's just that rich, mechanically deep, thematic, and plain fun to play. A fictional game like Red Dust Rebellion that uses the Counter-Insurgency or coin system has both an easier and harder time of it than a game focusing on a historical conflict. Easier because the designer doesn't have to try and fit history into a box. There is no history book or facts that you can compare this game to and what it's trying to simulate. Yet in other ways, it's harder because there is no history here to draw on in its creation. There isn't known history to pull you in. This isn't a conflict involving the United States or the Roman Empire or a Latin American dictatorship, rich with stories of men and the decisions they made, along with the consequences of those decisions. All of what Red Dust Rebellion had to, no doubt with inspiration from many sources, come from the mind of the designer. He had to create a world that we would not only care enough about to learn the story of, but care enough about to learn the complex game and mechanisms around it, well enough to understand and experience that world. And I'm thrilled to say that the designer, J. Carmichael, succeeded wonderfully. It's not perfect, and it won't be the game for everyone. This isn't the average low or medium weight game that every person is able to just pick up and play for a casual gaming experience alone or with others. It's a heavy game. The rules are complex. It takes a long time to play. And it can be fiddly at times, not just with the mechanics themselves, but even bookkeeping the victory track for each faction. But the reward for that hard work, after the hours it takes to learn and the hours it takes to play, makes all of that work worth it. And once you've grokked the rules, you're in for an incredibly rewarding experience. Red Dust Rebellion is my absolute favorite coin game and one of my new favorite war games that I can play solitaire. All right, for those who watch my reviews, I've started recommending a book to go along with the game. While there's no novelization of this game yet, if you can't get enough the idea of rebellion in the solar system in the near future and haven't read the science fiction classic The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein, I can't recommend it enough. One of the most influential science fiction books I read when I was growing up and being introduced to the genre. Thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review. Please let me know what you think of my video and this game in the comments below. And until next time, everyone, later.